Our scripture for today is from Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22 through chapter 6, verse 9. Ephesians chapter 5. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church, for we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him.
Well, this is one of those passages that for some people, they kind of like, he's talking on submission. We're out of here. Others, guys, if you know what this text really demands of you, might say, this is a good weekend for us to be gone. It's a challenging text. And in 40-some years, this is the kind of text that typically can generate a few emails on Monday. So feel free to send them. I'll get to them next year. One of the things that happens in a text like this is you kind of tend to zero in, and a lot of times when people are preaching, they may do this in 3 different weeks. One on the marriage, one on the family, parenting, and then one on work. And that's not a wrong thing to do, but the thing that happens, I think, when you do all 3 of those is you miss the connective pieces and what Paul is doing with them. There's some things that are involved in all 3 of them. They all come from the same design, and they all have, at some level, the same potential impact. And that's why I wanted to look at them together. It's pretty beefy. It's a lot to go through, so buckle up. However, what causes me to pull these together is that the design that God is teaching us comes from somewhere. It's not just artificial where God says, hey, let me put a man and a woman together and let me put a family together and the way you go to work. And there's a design there. And the premise of it is if you honor the design, there's going to be blessing. He particularly, just straightforward, says it to the kids. Kids, you obey your parents, you're going to do two things. You're going to invite the blessing of God upon your life, and number two, you're going to invite longevity. So this morning, if you're not honoring your parents and you, in fact, have set them aside and dishonored them, you're asking God to remove his blessing and you want to die young. So if you want that, hang in there and listen. I've more than a few times when I see a child acting in a way, and I usually never do it without the parent right there, say to them, would you like to know how to live really old and really good? Then you need to change the way you're treating your mom right now. And there's a blessing there. If we honor the design, there will be a blessing. Personally, but it doesn't stop there. The blessing ultimately, as Paul unveils, is that the world gets a picture of the covenant of God to his church. And when they get that picture, it draws them to Christ. Implication. One of the most powerful evangelistic tools you have is your marriage, your family, and the way you work. One of the most powerful evangelistic tools. Why do we know this? Because Paul, in verse 32, he gives them a left curve that should just make every baseball fan proud. This is a profound mystery. What's the mystery? The two shall become one. Where did he get that language? Two becoming one, is that new math? No. That's old math. The two shall become one. Did that come from Genesis? No, it came from God. The three that are one, the three that make up male and female, Genesis 1:27, 26. And so he's unveiling something, and Paul just finished this beautiful instruction about marriage. But then he says in verse 32, by the way, I'm not talking about marriage. I'm talking about Christ and the church. What? You mean the marriage has the capacity to reflect the covenant of God to his church? Yes. That's a little bit of what Jesus was praying in John 17 when he said, Father, may they be one like you and I are one, so that the world will know that you sent me. The design that God has created for the marriage and for the family and also for work comes from God. And when we honor it, when we adhere to it, there's blessing. But it's beyond blessing. There's transformation. People come to Christ. Like Allender said, if your marriage is not drawing people to Christ, you don't have a good marriage. And if your family is not drawing people to Christ, you don't have a good family. And if the way you work isn't drawing people to Christ, you don't have a good work ethic. Why? Because when you honor the design of God, he brings personal blessing to you and transformation to the lost. That's why I wanted to put all three of these together. It's a lot, but let's jump into it. Where does he begin? It's the marriage. And he says to the wives, wives, I'm going to read verse 22, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Now, you've probably looked at this text before, but in case you haven't, the NIV, NASB, pretty much every version adds something to 22 that's technically not in there. That little word, submission. Wives, submit to your husbands. The term submit is not in the original language. So what are they doing? Adding to the Bible? Well, no. It says submit later, and it says submit in 21. But you have to connect it to 21, and if you don't, by and large, I think people misinterpret this. And they misinterpret it because they come to this definition that submission of a wife is the husband calls all the shots. The husband is the decision maker. The husband is the master of the finances. The husband is the buck stops with him. How do you get there? Well, you get there by looking at this term and saying submission needs to come under. It does. Submission means to come under the strength of another person. But let's go back to look at verse 21 for a moment. Verse 21, Paul is talking to the church, and he says, I want you to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And this is how he translates into 22. You all kind of see this big separation and in wives and husbands. It's labeled, but not when Paul was writing it. It sounded kind of like this. Let's read it together. Verse 21. Submit yourselves to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, to your husbands, as unto the Lord. How different is that when you link 21 and 22 together? It's huge. And I'll tell you why. When we submit to each other, do any of you say to the other person here, I'm going to submit to you. I'm going to come under your strength. I'm going to come under your authority. Do you say, you're the boss. You've taken all decision making away from me. You're my captain. I have to salute you. You're the buck stops and all the final decisions are made by you. I've heard people come up with ideas of submission that the wife is voiceless. The husband calls all the shots. The husband determines whether or not you buy the boat. God told me to buy the boat. Well, we don't have any money, but God told me I need to buy the boat. I mean, how do you argue with God, right? And if that's your view of submission, it's not our view in verse 21 that all personal responsibility is abdicated to some mysterious individual that has all authority over you. No. Wives, I want you to live with your husbands just the way we live with each other. I want you to come under the strength, and I want you to come under the leadership of that man. What does that look like if it's not all things are in his power? Let me give you some thoughts. I think it might mean, and I certainly do believe that it means, that you would listen to his counsel. Like I would listen to the counsel of other wise people in our church. I would come under the authority of wise people in particular areas. I would listen to them. In other words, your husband was given to you for something more than just a good landscaper or to take the garbage out on Wednesday. Listen to him. Now, I understand men have a little bit of an Achilles heel in this area. It's not that they can't listen. No, don't flip that. It's that whenever your husband listens to you, by nature, he likes to fix things. I do. I mean, my wife and I, it took us a long time to get this dance down. It did. I had no idea that listen means simply listen. Listen and fix go together. Honey, I'll listen to you. And if you got a problem with somebody, I'm on the phone. Got her done. You're exasperated with the kids, I'll kill them. No worries. Got it done. No. She had to teach me. Listen means listen. But wives, you might need to listen to their counsel. God gave you a husband. And yes, at times he likes to move too quickly into fixing things. But if I'm going to submit to someone and I'm going to come under them and I'm going to recognize their place, their gift to me, then I have to be willing to close my mouth and listen. I can't submit to any person that I never listen to. I can't submit to any person that I talk over. I can't submit to anyone that I have a solution and an answer before, we're done speaking. You have to listen. Because your husband has two gifts. Number one, he's a man and you're not. That's a wife. And I understand our world is tragically kind of denying gender differences. I happen to think that men and women are quite different. And there's a benefit in that. I see things very differently than my wife. And by the way, she does with me. And when I listen, I really respect the fact that she looks at life with a different lens than I do. And secondly, the reason why you listen is not just because they're different in their gender, but oftentimes your husband is not quite as enmeshed into the situation that you're dealing with. In other words, he has a level of objectivity. Now, you might think he has no understanding, but the fact is, give the guy a chance. God gave him to you as a gift. This moves it a little further, but not only listen to him, but give him the right to offer constructive criticism. Some of you draw the line right there. You said, over my dead body. That guy's been criticizing me ever since we got married. It's not what I'm asking. I'm asking for you to give him permission. Permission is where you say to a person, I do not want you to fear my openness to you. I do not want you to have to hurdle over a mountain to get to my heart. Let me give you an illustration outside of marriage how I've done this. I've done it inside of marriage as well. When I came here, I took a couple of people aside that I grew some trust with and said to them on our staff, you have permission to walk into my office. If you see me treating somebody unfairly, or I'm getting kind of bitey in my language, or I'm kind of sarcastic, whatever the case may be, do not ever fear that I want to hear from you, and do not ever think that I will be resistant to you. I don't give that permission to everybody. I gave it to a couple of people that I trust, that I've said to, I want you to have permission to come into my life and say things to me that others may be afraid. Don't go in there, that's the boss. No. Don't boss me. Walk in, sit down, do it kindly, and know my heart is open to you. Wives, that's a good thing to give to your husband. I want you to know that you have permission. Why is that important? Because if you go back and look at the definition of a woman, not mankind, but woman, Isha, by description, she is a woman who is open and therefore vulnerable and receptive. Meaning that a woman practices vulnerability, but her greatest power is when she brings people close to her, because it's in relationship with her that she'll transform your life. However, when a woman is sinning, when a woman is scared, when a woman is untrusting, she closes and reduces her vulnerability and gets dictatorial and managerial, especially of her husband. What does submission look like? It means to be a godly woman. I want you to open your heart to your husband, and I want you to give him permission to speak to you. Is it a scary place? Yeah. And by the way, if the only thing he speaks to you is criticism, you got another issue and we'll deal with it. I'd be happy to help you. Because nobody can bear under the weight of constant criticism. If that's the only thing you get from your husband, we need to chat. But if I'm going to submit to people, if I'm going to submit to my deacons, if I'm going to submit to some of my staff members, in the sense I have to give them permission, because otherwise I force them to walk into my office wondering, is my heart open to them? Give him the right to offer constructive criticism. And finally, look to his leadership. Look to his leadership. He may not lead perfectly, but God has made him the head of you. He may not be as in tune with Christ as you are, but he has a position to fulfill. He may not be as theologically equipped as you, and that can be a danger, and candidly, most men are quite aware that they are theological seconds in their home. Not all, but a lot of them are. But it doesn't mean that you have a perfect husband to be able to respect the position that God has given him. Again, let me go outside of marriage to give you an illustration. When my sister and I and brother found my father actually found me. He was homeless in L.A., Hemet specifically, but L.A. area. And I had to wrestle with the factor of what's my obligation to my dad. He abandoned our family, dumped us off, married another person. He was illegally a polygamist for years. And when he called and asked for help, I had a decision to make. Because I know what the Bible says, honor your father and mother. And it doesn't say it stops at 40. And by the way, it doesn't say if your father and mother treat you well. It says honor them. And in that moment, I had to decide, do I honor and obey Christ, or do I utilize my dad's complete illegitimate and pagan behavior to justify why I could just let him rot and head to hell? There are decisions that you're going to make in life, not because the other person has necessarily earned it, but because God commands you. And that's not a bad place to be at all. And sometimes you look to your husband's leadership not because he's as spiritually mature as you, but because God has given him a responsibility. And he's given you a command, and there is a design that works well, and there is a design. It doesn't mean that you abdicate everything over to him. It does mean that you find those areas in your life to respect him, to esteem him, to listen to him, to engage with him, just like I did with my dad. I didn't go to my dad for counsel. You don't go to a man who has lived the kind of life he lived for great counsel. I did treat him like my dad. I did call him dad. I did care for him like he was my dad, because he was. And wives, you can do that with your husbands. You can look to their leadership. You can esteem, you can expect leadership out of them as God does. Because that's God's design for marriage. And when you honor God's design, God brings blessing and he brings transformation. Husbands, you have an assignment as well. Husbands, I want you, verse 25, to love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing in water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle. You guys, in the same way, you ought to love your wives. There's two things that I want to encourage men that I think you can own from this text. Number one is very simply, you need to accept your role as a leader. It's not a position that you need to fight for. It's a position you've been entrusted by God. Own up. Own up, not in the sense that you become the bully, not in the sense that you become, the de facto decision maker. That's not a leader. The best leaders I've ever seen in this world are people who put really brilliant people around them, far more gifted in areas than them. One lady said it this way. She said, great leaders inspire people to have confidence in the leader. Yes, great leaders actually inspire people to have confidence in themselves. Who said that? Eleanor Roosevelt. It's a great leader. Great leader is not the person with all the answers. There's nobody that smart. Nobody. There's nobody that brilliant that they can do it all alone. Leaders inspire. Leaders equip. Leaders release. Leaders champion. Leaders open doors. And husbands, that's what God has called you to. 2004, when John Elway was giving his acceptance speech in the Hall of Fame, his dad, Jack, had died just a couple of years prior to that. And I remember John standing at the podium and said, there's one man that I wish was here today. Because it's because of him that I'm here. John went on and he said something really close to this. I would not be here today were it not for my dad, who inspired me, taught me how to play the game, taught me how to treat people. Husbands, that's what God's called you to do. He's called you to inspire your wife and your children and to lead in a way that they rise to a better level. Not that you call all the decisions. You can ask my wife. We've never made a decision in our life that had anything above $10 that we don't make together. Slight exaggeration, 20. The idea that I'm going to determine, yep, we're moving from Colorado to Oregon and not inquire of what God is speaking to her would be like foolishness. The idea that we would buy some property or that we would plan something, that I would make the final decision, would be absurd and would be a definition of leadership that doesn't come from the scriptures at all. Husbands, lead like Christ leads the church. Does Christ make every decision for you? No. Does he eliminate your human volition? No. Does he inspire you? Yes. Does he release you? Yes. Does he equip you? Yes. Does he domineer you? No. Husbands, lead that way. And secondly, accept your role as a lover. Husbands, I want you to love your wives, just like Christ loved the church. How did he love the church? Well, he gave himself up for her. He left heaven. He came down to this earth and he sacrificed for her. And he loved her. And as you structure your life, do you make your family structure themselves around you, or do you structure your life around them? Do you have a special chair that the kids all know that's Dad's? You don't sit in that chair. If you do, you might want to go home and sell it today or give it to your wife. Because the idea that leadership means that I get things the way I want and I have you orchestrate your life around me, again, it's not from the scriptures at all. It's the idea that I walk into my house as a servant and I'm here to serve you, to elevate you, and to structure my life to a degree as best I can. Still got to go to work, but around you. Not to make you selfish. But dear friends, Jesus didn't stay up in heaven and say, get your acts together down there. He left heaven. He came down here. He inconvenienced himself at a very, very significant level so that he could love you. How do you love yourself? Well, he goes on in verse 28 and he says, in the same way, husbands, I want you to love your wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. And after all, no one ever hated his own body. Husbands, how do you love your bodies? How do you nurture your bodies? You might not even use that language, but you do. How many of you last night was hungry? You don't have to raise your hand. And ate. Probably most of you. Anybody go to bed last night because you were tired? I did. So you nurture your body every day. You take care of it. You listen to it. When you're hungry, you eat. When you're thirsty, you drink. When you're tired, you go to bed. Paul says you love your body every day. You take care of it every day. In the same way, I want you to do that with your wife. I want you to take care of her because she has needs, not weaknesses. She's not inferior to you. Probably in most areas, she's quite superior to you. But the reality is God has given you the privilege of what? Nurturing her and caring for her. You don't hate your own body, right? Don't hate hers. She needs more sleep than you. That doesn't mean she's lazy. It means she needs more sleep than you. Let her sleep. My grandmother, she was a spectacular woman. She didn't need much sleep. I have no idea why. I prayed all my life. God made me like my grandma. She's a stud. Well, she's now in heaven. She went to bed at 2 a.m. every night, got up at 6. I was in awe of her. I don't like to sleep. I want to get things done. Sleep is an annoying thing to me. But the reality is some people, you need 8, 9 hours, and some people need 4 hours. It doesn't mean my grandmother's more righteous than you. It just means for whatever reason, God made her in a way. She didn't need sleep. She went to bed at midnight. She couldn't sleep. Her eyes are wide open. She works till 2. Boom, she sleeps. You accept your role as a lover, not as a dictator, not as a bully, but as a person who's willing to sacrifice and meet the very needs of your wife. It's a privilege. It's an honor. Why? Because the marriage has a larger purpose. What is its purpose? This is a profound mystery. I'm talking about Christ and the church. You see, your marriage is a picture of the covenant of God to the church. Your marriage makes the covenant of God tangible, relatable, understandable. And so when people get around your marriage, they can comprehend the idea that there is a God who would sacrifice. And so when people come into your home, and wives, they see you respect your husband and speak honorably of him and esteem him in front of other people, it literally draws them to Christ. John 17. And husbands, when you come in and you tell your family, your primary goal is not to adhere to my life and my schedule, but my primary goal is to sacrifice and serve you. When the non-Christian gets around that and they watch you, it will not only draw them to your family, but it will help them understand a God that would leave heaven, that would take on flesh and limit himself and die for you. Your marriage has a larger purpose, and it's connected to our families. Paul next goes into this issue of children, and he says to them, children, I want you to obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. It's the first commandment with a promise. Now, I don't know, candidly, if Paul expected this to be read in the church and all of the kids would say, okay, we're in, I'll obey them. Or maybe this is actually written and the primary target audience is parents. Because parents need to understand that it is your responsibility to expect, to solicit, and to train your children to be obedient. It's not becoming to you, it's not becoming to your children, and it's not becoming to God to have children that know how to talk back to their parents. It's not beneficial to them. Why? Because the home is this place where you're teaching your children obedience, but you're actually teaching them. Why? Because he next goes not only to teach them this, but rather that you would train them in the instruction of the Lord. In other words, your ultimate responsibility, mom and dad, is not to get them to play to you, but to the Father. I want to train you in the instruction, not of Mark, but of my Father in heaven. One day you're going to leave this home. And by the way, you do every day. When you go off to school, you go off to work. And I'm going to make it very simple in my family that you can get one over on me, because I'm not going to become a police detective, and I'm not going to put something on your phone or in your automobile where I can trace you every place and every way you go. My kids ask me, why wouldn't you do that, Dad? I said, because I'm not going to change the nature of my relationship with you from trust to suspicion. And if you don't know the value of that, you're a bigger fool than I thought. My primary commitment to you is to trust you and for you to trust me. However, my ultimate goal is to help you understand that when you leave our home, I will not know what you're doing. I will make that easy. But you do need to understand that every step of the way, the Father sees everything you do. And you will get away with nothing with God. And the sooner you and I realize that, the better our life is. My goal as a parent is to teach obedience, not primarily and ultimately to me, but to the Father. That's why Paul says, I want you to bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. I want to pass you off as my good friend Pete's dad did to him. Ed said to his son, Pete, when you leave this home, I want you to take all of the affection and the respect that you had to me, and I want you to give it to the Father who will lead you the rest of your life. I will always be your dad. I will always be a cheerleader. I will always be there for you. But your Father walks with you every step of the way, and he is the one who wants to lead you. That's what the home does. It prepares your children to love and to respect the authority of God. How do you do that, dads? It says, fathers, please do not exasperate your children. I'm going to not mess with the text of Scripture, but I don't think it's too much of a stretch to infer that this would also be instruction to women, mothers. I don't think it's just dads that can exasperate their children. Quite honestly, don't be offended by this. I've seen plenty of moms exasperate their children. So I think it can go both ways. Well, what does it mean to exasperate them? Bring them to the point where they have no options. They're pinned into a corner. They have no way to win. There's no way to respond. And you have just used your force and your power to pin them down to the point where the only thing they can do is just throw up the white flag. Okay, I surrender. I'm done. You win. Don't frustrate them. Don't take them to the point where the only thing that they can respond with is steam. If that's the case, then what do? Do you just remove all boundaries? Of course not. That's not what he just said. But no, you create a house where rules aren't your primary gift to them. It's a context and an environment of grace. As one great parent lectured, he said, make it your goal to not focus on the behavior of your children, but the heart of your children. I always loved that, and I thought the man was a really wise and godly man. Not a professional speaker, he's a landscaper who just happened to be really, I think, a brilliant dad. But what exasperates one kid may not exasperate another. My first son loved laws, very obedient. My third son, very kind, very willing to obey. My second son, let's move on. There was a season that either he or my wife were going to go to jail. I love him. I would take a bullet for him, but I really preferred my wife staying home. Our children were very different. I bet yours are too. And what it means is that you have to parent to the child. And maybe what works with one child will exasperate another. And what one child needs in your family, maybe another child doesn't need at all. That's the art of parenting. And so what Paul gives us here are these guidelines. Don't put your child in a place and a predicament where their fuse is lit all the time. But rather, create an environment of grace where you're helping them see the benefit of obedience and you're helping them see the delight of authority. And you're helping them understand that ultimately, friends, just like you dads, you don't ultimately play to your wife, and you certainly don't play to me. You play to the Father. Wives, you don't ultimately determine your behavior based upon how your husband lives. You do it based upon what God calls you to. Kids, one of these days you're going to leave our home. You're going to be out on your own. And I want you to understand that the God who loves you sees you, and he sees everything you're doing. Don't think for a moment. It's easy to get one over on dad. That's easy. You'll never get one over on God. I want to train you what it looks like to have God see everything you do, who loves you. Last, Christ and work. Slaves, people with no authority, people who have no vote, people who can't even own property. I want you to obey your earthly masters. I don't want to spend your time trying to get out from underneath them. I want you to obey them. And I want you to respect them. And I want you to treat them with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them, not necessarily to impress them, but you obey them because you're obeying the will of God. What's the design? The design is this: when you go to work, you go to worship. You're going to fulfill the will of God. You're going, as Romans 12:1 says, in view of God's mercy, present your bodies a living sacrifice unto God, holy and acceptable to him, which is your what? Spiritual service of worship. When you go to work this afternoon, you're going to go to worship. You think, nope, I went to worship this morning. No, you go to worship this afternoon. Why? Because you're going to present your bodies to God, and you're going to have an employer, and that employer may be good, bad, or indifferent. That employer may not be great. That doesn't change the nature of your behavior. Any more than if you have a wife who is stubborn and recalcitrant and just won't respect you. Doesn't change. You die for her. You lay your life down for her. You don't determine your behavior based upon her. You don't determine your behavior of honoring your parents based upon how good they are. You do it because why? God commanded it, and God has a design. And when I honor the design, there is blessing. And when I honor the design, there is transformation. And by the way, that transformation may be your husband. It may be your wife. It may be your kids. I want you to go to work, and I want you to worship. And I want you to have a mutual respect for those at work. I want you to treat them as if your boss is Jesus. I want you to treat them as if the person who sits next to you at a desk is Christ. Pastor, you know that person, they gossip. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't. Not from the text. You treat them with respect and you honor them, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not men, because you know that the Lord will bless everyone for whatever good he does, whether he is a slave or a free. What do they all have in common? A Christ-centered marriage, and a Christ-centered family, and a Christ-centered vocation or work. They have a design that God has given to us. And when we honor that design, God gives us blessing. To those at work, it's a reward. To the child, it's good life and a long life. To the husband and wife, it's the multiple blessings that come when you honor God. When you honor the design, God brings you blessing. And when God brings you blessing, he brings transformation. It might be your marriage that will ultimately be the catalyst that saves your neighbor. It might be your obedience and honoring your parents that draws another person out of their stupor and allows them to see the glory and the beauty of God. But the beauty of God's design, let it shine in your relationships. Why? Because it will ultimately draw others to the Savior who transforms their lives. Your marriage is not just for procreation. And your marriage is not just so that you have a hiking buddy on the weekend. Your marriage is not so that you have somebody to retire with. Your marriage is not just so that you have somebody to go to a movie with. Your marriage is a picture of the covenant of God in the church. And God's going to save people through you. And he's going to save people as they watch you, dads, lay your life down for your children. And he's going to save people when you go to work and you realize, I'm here to worship. There's a design that God has given us. When you honor it, there's blessing. Lord Jesus.